Okay, welcome back, everyone. So we are on item 12, which is the ESG sustainability. Is that correct? Item 12? Yes, okay, good. ESG sustainability policy informational update. Just as a reference, this is an item that the committee had asked a subcommittee of the investment committee over the past year, working with staff and consultants to look at our ESG policy, which has been in place for a number of years. So we studied the origin of the policy, what has happened with that policy to date, and how we want that policy to look on a forward-looking basis. So today's presentation by staff and the consultants is to give us an overview of where we're at and some recommendations for how this policy, where it will be in the future. So today's informational, so get some feedback from the committee if there is any. There's also time between now and the July meeting for members of the public and stakeholders to also engage with our staff in the appropriate manner to get input and feedback as well. So today's informational, and you can bring us up to date, Ms. Sheehan, as to where we're at.
And I'll jump in as Ann's getting the microphone on. So as Harry said, the subcommittee has been talking about this for a while, so that's why I put it down as a second reading, but we are bringing it back in July for the final adoption. We really do want your input, and I think the big change, which we outline in here, is the subcommittee challenged us and said, do you really want the 21 risk factors as a rules-based policy? And when we looked at all of our global peers, everyone else was on a principles-based policy. So it was at that point we made the decision, we're keeping the 21 risk factors, but there are kind of three layers of policies here. Not policy, you have law, and fiduciary law is the overarching one. Then you have your policies. Then staff has day-to-day guidelines, and the 21 risk factors will be part of our guidelines that our managers will see and will work with. But that's why we're changing this. So with that, I will turn over to Ann and to Brian.
So following up on our April meeting, so we've made a few revisions, and at the July meeting, we'll come back and do a red line from our original policy with the 20 risk factors in this one, but this one is just getting additional input. So a couple of things I want to point out to respond to the committee members. Dana, on INV 44, in that second bullet from the top, we added, you wanted us to make reference of we will align with like-minded investors and organizations in order to be more effective in our engagement efforts and to enhance the stability of the capital markets. So we captured that. And then I think, Paul, in responding to some of the stakeholder groups, we added worker rights under the S provision so that it's more explicit in terms of that issue as an S issue under the examples of ESG risk factors. I think the one thing, and Chris and Josh, who really did a lot of work on this, added the concept of CVAR, conditional value at risk. So it really is the test, sort of the quantitative test of what's material, and a calculation in that regard. And then we'll do a qualitative assessment also in terms of how important it is, the risk to how it could potentially violate the trust of our members, reputational risks, those sort of more qualitative factors that we'll look into. I think the other thing that we added is that even if something doesn't hit the CVAR and the other, we still will engage on issues. They just may not be as material to the portfolio, and we may, it's an allocation of resources in that regard. But we wanted to make sure that it was clear that we'll still engage on issues, talk to companies, respond to the stakeholders on those, but we'll sort of have a couple of prong tests in terms of the amount of resources that are put in and dedicated to the engagement on those efforts. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about CVAR, if there are questions from the committee members on this.
Just procedurally, if it's okay with my committee members, that will allow staff to finish the presentation and we'll go to questions. Absolutely. Okay.
So when the committee told us to really look at a level of materiality, right now everything is catching our lens, and a lot of it is coming to you. And so, in fact, PCA gave us a memo in March recommending that we have a materiality threshold applied. We talked to the auditors, we talked to the lawyers, we talked to a lot of the groups who have defined materiality. And the concern was about a bright line and the realization that as the fund grows and changes in size, $1 million figure, a $100,000 figure isn't appropriate. And it means one thing in global equity and it means a whole other thing in fixed income. So we came back with, and it is complex, but we're going to put the math formula as a footnote for those that want to understand what it is. But in a nutshell, CVAR is picking up for every individual asset class. It has its own distribution pattern of volatility. And remember, we talk about that nice smooth bell curve, and we were talking earlier, investments isn't a smooth bell curve, but what we care about are what we call the fat tails. The real big surprises, good, but especially bad. CVAR, we can adjust how big we're measuring, but how much of that tail? So our risk definition, if you think of it this way, is the risk definition is worrying about the big events on the left tail for that particular asset class. But it's represented by a mathematical formula. So as that asset class becomes more volatile or less volatile, that number changes. And as our commitment to that asset class changes, that number. So we ran the CVAR, and my example would be inflation sensitive, which has a lot of different stuff in it. But basically, we're saying that at this CVAR level, anything that would result in a 14% loss would be an extreme bad event to that asset class. We're using that as a measuring stick. So if you think about this as a scaling up of resources, because that's really what it's designed to do, is how much time and effort do we put into this particular issue? So if something's going to hit a 15% negative return to the asset class, you're going to hear about it and you're going to be involved in it. If it's a 15% hit to a portfolio, we'll report to you on it, but probably not take your time. So a portfolio being some subset of an asset class. But we'll have sent staff out, we'll be investigating it, we'll probably have a lot of staff on it. If in this case, it's less than 15% of a sub-portfolio, so in other words, a manager's account or something like that, we'll still engage, because I know Dana asked that question, with the strawberry fields. We'll still engage, but it's a matter of how much time and effort do we put into it at the STRS level. And so think of this as a good sliding scale. This is a test. We have to use it for a while. We've made it tighter for global equity because that's such a big asset class. Every other asset class is less than 15% of the fund. And so we will use this as a scale, but it is a very good sophisticated tool to measure the risk of an asset class. And the one thing I would add, if you look at an INV 44, there's A, B, and C, which are kind of our almost in reverse order, our scaling up of your time and attention. In B, well, it's nice to put the CIO, but from B and C, I would actually add a comma and put in consultation with the investment committee chair and vice chair, because so many of these issues have that added impact of affecting the membership in different ways, and it's hard to gauge. We use the word a material impact to a significant portion of the members. Well, we don't survey the members. And I'll pick on lovely Santa Monica since we like to do that a lot. The bubble of Santa Monica might care a lot, but if the rest of the state doesn't care, is that a significant majority? It is in Santa Monica because Santa Monica thinks it is the center of the world. So there we go. Well, that's decided. 2 board members from Santa Monica. So it's trying to use it, It's trying to use it as a way to scale it up. And I think it would be helpful to have some outside influence to know where the board is at with these issues of, yes, this reaches a level where the board wants to know and be involved, or whether no, let's delegate staff and have staff contribute resources to it.
So let's go to some questions, comments from the committee.
Thanks, Harry.
Sure.
I really appreciate all the work that's been done on this, and while I understand the value of looking at a more principle-based policy here, and I think at the outset, I had expressed concerns about being sure that staff still had a pretty good degree of flexibility at the end of this. And so I think one thing I would ask if you could bring back the next time is just an application of the CVAR so we could kind of see it at work in terms of what that would look like. But I guess it feels a little, I know we're trying to establish a bright line, but it feels a little artificial to me. And as stringent as the 21 risk factors are, I'm not sure that this approach necessarily captures some things that would be important. And I mean, I'm kind of now finding myself going back and really wanting to just have the staff kind of work through these issues and bring forward what they believe are going to be those risks that we need to pay attention to. And that's, you know, in some ways defeating the purpose of this whole effort that we've undergone. But for example, when we do our engagement with others, I mean, how do we capture, you know, kind of the circumstances of that type of engagement? And I don't think any engagement is really kind of bright line, you know, quantitative, qualitative. I mean, there's so much that goes into factoring in, you know, what we're going to pursue as a priority. And I'd hate to have some kind of artificial construct that's going to drive our resources that aren't necessarily going to get to, you know, some of these other areas that are covered by the 21 risk factors that isn't picked up here through this approach.
I just want to be sure. Do you see the risk factors coming back into staying its current placement in the policy itself, or are you comfortable with those being essentially inside of, as staff is engaging managers, they still are working from the
Yes.
list fact?
Yes, the latter. The latter.
The latter,
Yeah.
okay, very good. Okay. Does staff want to respond to Ms. Xi's comments or thoughts, or?
I'll jump in first, Dan. You know, the great points, and I think what we can do is give you some hard examples
Yeah.
of, as I'm just looking down the list, I already know from CVAR, you know, climate change, energy management, waste management would be things, human health, accounting would be things that would be coming to your attention. As I look down kind of our examples of the 21 risk factors, if a company has, say, a product line of 15 products and it's one product we don't particularly like, or in one market, that would be something where we're proposing in the policy staff deals with, but it doesn't create board attention and take investment committee time. Ann, do you want to add more?
Yeah.
But we could certainly put examples in here too.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
I guess what I want to understand, and perhaps I didn't understand exactly the question, that is the concern that we're creating a bright line of things over and above,
I mean,
and we won't
I
pay
think we
it.
started this because we had wanted to have some way of determining materiality on a quantitative basis. And I'm not so sure that, well, I personally, I don't, I guess, fully subscribe to that, because I think there are so many other factors that really go into considering what, in determining, evaluating ESG risks. And so I just found kind of this to be a little too stringent, I guess. And still understanding that there will be incorporation of the 21 risk factors in this process. But I guess, and part of why I'm asking for examples is I just don't want us to inadvertently kind of miss opportunities. And that may not be a consequence, but I just don't know.
And, okay, go ahead, Ms.
Okay.
Sheehan, and then Alan,
So-
would you, Ms. Temkin, would you
Yeah.
respond after Ms. Sheehan?
I guess let me answer it this way, sort of from, in the position I'm in my day job.
Yeah.
Okay, and how I don't really see this much changing what my staff and I do on a regular basis. What I see it is almost, it could be a bit of a triage in terms of the things that are, really impactful and important from a CVAR perspective. And it's a way more of measuring the impact of the risk or the risk of the issue to the portfolio. And reporting on the level of risk. It can be financial risk in terms of our exposure to a certain industry, to a certain issue. But from my perspective, we'll still do and focus on the issues and many of the 21 risk factors and some others that had developed on our day-to-day role and job. So does that?
So do you think that what's proposed here actually then helps you with respect to prioritizing resources?
It helps, I think it'll help prioritize some of the resources in terms of, okay, this is a really big issue, can have a very big impact on a certain portfolio. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to spend some time on some that may not trigger, get to that level because it's of interest to the stakeholders. It still can affect our reputational risks, some of the other qualitative issues that we will also take into account.
So given that, I guess then, and I hope this doesn't sound kind of stupid, but do we need this then? Because with current practice, if we were to leave it with current practice, then Chris and you would just bring forth these types of investments on the natural anyway.
Well, I think the issue was to try and respond to the board on really bringing material issues that we had the discussion at the subcommittee.
Yeah.
So that the most focus will be on the things that are the most risky to the portfolio, going back to our discussions at the subcommittee level.
And
Yeah,
I'd add,
that's
I think the current practice has evolved. For a long time, we were bringing you everything.
Right.
Because we're on a couple of issues a year. Geraldine likes to remind me, I told her her job would be episodic, and it has so far been on and never slowed down. And I think we've evolved now to a process, frankly, where we raise issues to Harry and to Tom and ask the chair and the vice chair to decide judgment-wise, is this something the committee should spend time on or not? And this would give us at least more clear to our stakeholders and others, what's our threshold? So we heard you want us to keep engaging, but at what level does it scale up to where we're flying people around the country, around the world, or where we're then bringing it to you and even doing more dramatic? Letter writing, engaging our managers, that's, like Ann said, that's what we do every day. So it's a measuring tool, or at least a device. And I think we recognize that these are complex issues that aren't black and white. And we know that this will be a work in progress as we work through it. Our peer group that we look to could not give us a good definition of what reaches their principles, what violates a principle, and what does not.
Mr. Hemken?
I think
Betty, are you still on the floor?
I'm done for now.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
I think the staff, and I think they've done a good job, have tried to combine science and art. And the science aspect is putting numbers down, and at the end of the day, those numbers, to trigger those numbers would probably take only a handful of events would trigger those numbers. And that would be something that would automatically have come to you, in my opinion, under any circumstance. I do not see anything in this document that would change the current business practices of the staff. And my opinion is the goal was to filter what comes to you on a regular basis so that you're not burdened with 10 or 15 issues that the staff is more appropriately delegated the responsibility to deal with. And that's the intent. And if it's unclear or it doesn't accomplish that, I think it's our duty to go back and rewrite it to accomplish that objective. But it's trying to combine both the art and the science.
Okay. No, that's, thank you.
Ms. Dillon?
So Ann, forgive me if you already spoke to this, I came back in late from break, but on, under the principles, the very last bullet, you talk about, we'll actively exercise our rights as investors in a sustainable manner. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think,
Or how we exercise our right in a sustainable manner. I get the whole, we want it to align with our sustainability beliefs, and I think I have my arms wrapped around that.
well, I think in that regard, we mean sort of a permanent, ongoing, responsible way is how we're doing this.
Okay. That makes sense to me, so I just wasn't,
Transparent, inclusive, because when we talk about sustainability, it's kind of taken on this, different meaning. But it really is sustaining the portfolio for the long run and for the benefit of the teachers.
and being consistent in the manner in which we apply those.
I would say you could almost substitute the word consistent, a consistent manner. Because Dana, you're our longest serving board member, you've seen how the board has moved over time. We want to
Right.
try and be able to stay the course for decades at a time.
Absolutely. All righty. And then the last part, or my second question is under B, number 2, that we're going to assess the gravity of an ESG issue that comes before us. But in the language that we have here, it actually talks about the ESG policies. We're not really going to have if we move in this direction, we're not really going to have an ESG policy anymore.
I think they're gonna
It's more like the,
underlie.
Actually, I think what I was thinking about was the 21 risk factors.
Yeah, the 21 risk
And the 21 risk factors then become guidelines, but we're still going to have this ESG policy.
Yeah, this.
Never mind.
This is,
Well,
if you look
is
at
it the
title-
violation of the risk factors? Their guidelines?
Well, but the guidelines will follow the policy, so that's why we put the word policy in here. They'll flow from that. And that's why
Right.
we give some of the examples.
So I guess I was having a hard time tying what we have as our principles and what was written here as something that could be violated. It's easy for me to see how the 21 risk factors get violated, but not necessarily what we have written here. And
Well,
maybe that's what I was
And-
trying to
And I
reach for.
think that's where the concept of going to a principles-based, we're moving away from the rules-based.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be somewhat more subjective in that regard, and judgmental. But I think we will take from the experience that we've had with the 21 risk factors and other issues to help inform us about the types of risks that we will be engaging on. But you're right.
And perhaps even make a broader, our ability broader to,
We can bring in other issues. We won't just
Engage in
have
that.
the 21, because as you know, everybody, it used to, I can say this, they look up our list and they try and figure out,
Right.
okay, which one did they violate, And so they would,
or if it wasn't listed, then what can we get away with, kind of like, okay. Thank you, I appreciate your explanation.
Hendricks?
This is great. I feel like we're kind of moving along, and I appreciate Betty's comments, because I do think I felt the same way, the art and science conflict. We want to have metrics and we want to measure, but to your point, a lot of this stuff doesn't fit in a box, or we can't check a box of you violated X, Y, and Z. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I just had a couple of questions, because I keep feeling like, we've changed our policies, so we're integrating ESG into all of our asset classes. It's in each of our policies. And we want to be proactive. We want to engage with managers so that when we have a new manager relationship, that they know from the outset, this is who we are at CalSTRS, and these are our principles, and you need to ascribe to these principles in order to do business with us. So we want to be proactive instead of reactive. And so one of my questions in terms of how we integrate ESG and how we as a board oversee that integration, to me is there a way? I like that. I appreciate what Chris is bringing up, the language around making sure to include the investment chair and vice chair. I'm fine with delegating. I guess I know for me as a board member, I still feel like we're learning about how to integrate ESG on all these asset classes, and I don't want to miss out on hearing how we're doing that across all of our asset allocation. And so I'm just wondering, maybe Chris, with your relationship with the chair and vice chair of the investment committee, if there's a way whether it's annually or semi-annually, we could get just an overview. We don't have to get into the weeds, but maybe there could be some color on how we are engaging our ESG policy in the different asset classes, because I would imagine it's different in each of those asset classes. And I just know for this board member, I would appreciate it at the beginning. Perhaps we don't need that in 2 years or 3 years, but so I guess that's one thing I felt just in reading is it defers a lot to, I'm just trying to find the language. So like at the CIO's discretion, that the investment staff will directly engage corporate management to seek information. Let's see, following the engagement, the CIO and investment staff may brief the investment committee. So it's kind of more, I guess I'm in contract negotiations with my local right now too. So I'm always seeing the may versus shall or should. And so I guess it's a request to maybe either add something so that we have some kind of reporting process maybe for the next couple of years, whether that might not be the will of the entire investment committee. But I assume you will bring things to our attention. I know that because you do that, Anne, all the time. But I'm just wondering in a more kind of maybe in a more official with our language that we have something where we hear back on how we're integrating our ESG policy across asset classes on an annual basis or something like that for the next few years. Just because that's not clear in here, and that's something that since we've gotten rid of our corporate governance committee, I keep feeling like I want to make sure that we're getting enough commentary from staff so that we feel like we're providing oversight in that arena.
I think what we can do is go back and see if there's a place that it fits in here, or if it's in the section where we do some of the other reports.
Sure.
Because now we do, each of the asset classes certifies that their managers are following the 21 risk factors. So once this is adopted, we're going to have to figure out the implementation.
Okay.
So maybe in conjunction with that, we could come back and figure out where it belongs in the reporting cycle and how to do it. We will continue, like in July, I'm going to do a corporate governance update, in July for you all. So we'll continue, as I say, I don't see much changing with this changing
Right.
in terms of how much you'll hear from us on this issue, or Geraldine and Sarah on issues that some of the stakeholders may bring and reporting back on those. But we'll go back and see if there's either here or someplace in our general reporting where we could put some additional language that perhaps it just sort of formalizes
Yeah.
some mechanism, and we'll take a look and see where that could fit.
And then I just had one other thing to say. So on the examples of ESG risk factors, when I was looking, and I know that this is not meant to be exhaustive, so with that being said, I did feel like, I was raving in April about how great the corporate governance report is from last year. And I wondered if under governance, language around diversity and majority vote and things like that, I didn't see that language under governance, and I just wondered, since that seems to be areas that your report highlights, and it certainly seems to be something that we are spending a lot of time and energy focusing on, if that language might want to be highlighted under governance, like diversity.
On diversity, to add, yeah, because it's just, it's an illustrative list, and it's not
Right.
final. We could certainly add diversity in general,
Because accounting, it's like, yeah,
figure out
accounting.
on good governance.
Well, I took
Because
the
to us,
language.
they fall under some of the majority vote or just the traditional governance, proxy access, declassified board. That to us is just general good governance.
Sure,
And it's sort of implied in there
right.
in terms of that. But we could see if there's some language, and certainly on the diversity, we could put it in a more proactive way.
Well, I was just looking at the language from your report, and it was executive compensation, diversity, geopolitical risk, majority vote, and sustainability. And to me, it just seems like being able to be, since those are values out of corporate governance,
Yeah,
if
and-
this is a document people are going to see, or we're going to have the ESG risk factors be something our staff are engaging, it seems to me like that language.
Yeah, and some of those compensation, we changed to general compensation, so it could include, human capital, not just executive compensation, but all compensation as the governance of the company. So,
Okay.
Alan?
Yep. I think the goal is to be inclusive and not exclusive. And it might be better just to say that these are not exclusive, they're inclusive, because all of them could have 4 or 5 sub-bullets, and you'd end up having a statement which is burdensome. So my suggestion would be maybe just to have a statement to make that clear.
Appreciate that, Alan. I think it's
Thanks, Alan.
important for us to, for me to hear, nothing dramatically is going to change in how we're operating and how the staff is engaging by these amendments and proposed changes. What ideally will happen is there would be a better filter as to what comes before this full investment committee. And there will be tremendous discretion that the chair and vice chair will have in consultation with senior staff. And our hope is that folks won't go through and use what we believe is to be something that we're very proud of, which is our policy and our 21 risk factors, which I don't think there's many other institutional investors that have such policies. We've used it, and over the years, what's happened is people have been able to pick off specific aspects of it and then use that as, and just, if I was in their shoes, I would do the same thing to try to drive issues that are important and important to all of us. But we have to be thoughtful about our time and our human capital and our financial capital, how we're allocating it. Nothing fundamentally is going to change is how we're engaging companies and what's important to this, to CalSTRS. And as was stated, all other institutional investors are principles-based, not rules-based. And we've been operating more in a rules-based, and it's been taking up a lot of staff time and committee time on ultimately issues that are important to us, but don't really move the needle of the portfolio. And we have to be, so we're evaluating where we're at with this and how do we get better. We're not abandoning any of our values and beliefs. Ms. Yamamoto, and we've got a few other members too.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions. I just wanted a little bit of history on the 21 risk factors. But not a whole lot, not a whole lot. I just wanted to know, how are they weighted? Are they in any order of importance, or are they just in order that you think about them?
I'll jump in. They started in 2003 as we started to expand into emerging markets. The first about 12 were principles based in prior policies and in other international documents. Then the board expanded it to 20 as we went through the emerging markets country exposure, and it really was originally that kind of a document. We moved to 21 when we added human health. I think it was 2007. So they are not weighted. They're all equal, but that's why the beginning has kind of more rule of law and kind of traditional legal governance, and then the latter end gets more into things like environment and human health and other issues. Really just had to do we just added them on as the issues arose.
Okay, good.
So let me, if you turn to, actually, we have them in the next agenda item. INV 71 is our current policy, and starting on INV 73 is the list of our current 21 risk factors. And so, as Chris said, they're not in any priority order. They're just listed as and they're fairly, we've dealt with these for a long time. Monetary policy, accounting, securities regulation, auditing, things that would have been pertinent going into the emerging markets. But we've added human health, we have environmental, workers' rights, those types of issues. So that's the current list of 21 risk factors that we have. And that's sort of the rules base that we'll still address all these issues in our risk factors, but we're just not going to list them anymore. Because I think, as Harry said, and as what we learned, is people will take our list and try and, if they have another issue, figure out one where it fits
Where it goes in.
And so this will give us the ability to be more subjective and qualitative, that there are these other risks that may not fit into these, but are important to our portfolio and could create an ESG risk to our portfolio.
Thanks. And then just one more thing. You probably explained this a lot, but I wasn't sure what materiality means?
Karen's asking all the good questions.
So there's a big discussion. Under securities law, material actually is a threshold of what companies have to report under, at the Securities and Exchange Commission, what is materiality. And also under accounting, under the FASB and the GASB regulations, if it's material, it has to be reported. So the attempt would be, and what really materiality means under, Brian can correct me if I get this, it was a Supreme Court definition on materiality that the omission of that information would have been material to a like-minded investor. So if two investors, if you didn't report that, we would both think we need that information. It's pertinent to the investment. And so it is actually a legal terminology that has evolved through court cases over time. That is really what materiality is. But in the vernacular, it is an important fact or piece of information that investors need to make an informed decision to make an investment.
Okay, so it's kind of like a disclosure of some sort then?
Well, it is definitely a disclosure because it's making sure that you're disclosing something that is material.
Okay.
Excuse me, could I just comment here? Because I think this has gotten a little off track.
Hold on, let me see if I can. Just. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Hunter.
So materiality means a lot of things in different contexts. That's, this, what Ann is talking about is the standard about what companies have to disclose when you're buying or selling their securities. That's really not an apt standard when you're saying, how does something affect our portfolio? And I think that's really the most imaginative part of this new policy is they've come up with a metric to say value at risk, to say this is what we'll look for to see if something's material to how this part of the portfolio is going to perform. So I hope that clarifies it.
Ms. Yamamoto, you still have the floor if you'd like. Back to you. Okay. I'd like to skip back to the person who is next in line, Mr. Rosenstiel, and how do I click on something?
I think you can click on his name
Yeah,
and then put it up in the white box.
yeah, well,
I was in the queue, but I never got in it. Okay.
Does it work with you?
I've got to remove the requirement.
Highlight his name.
and,
Was he in line at all?
yeah, he's
You should go previous to
previous.
get back to it.
Yep,
There we go.
Dana, you're the best.
She's-
Mr. Rosenstiel.
Okay, thank you. So, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I appreciate all the work that was done, and when I started this conversation, I was really supportive of it, and now I'm really confused, because I thought that what we were doing was, we had a conversation, we had a process and a discussion over many months, and it had led to an investment belief that we adopted, which said that our ESG principles are driven primarily by a material impact on our investments, and on the long-term health of our investments. That they're not driven by, and we see this, it pops up in agenda materials all the time, that we don't have the luxury to just decide that we want to pursue a political agenda with our investments. So the concept of materiality was to say, and what I loved about getting away from the 21 risk factors was to say that when we talk about any particular investment, the one risk factor may be material for one industry or one investment and not for another. That was the brilliance, it seems to me, of what SASB has done. And you know, we've had presentations on their work. I think that's wonderful stuff. But now I'm not. What I don't see in here, and I like the idea of trying to, you know, come up with a number for a measure of materiality, although I think that materiality is always something every investor makes a judgment about. So I've never myself felt that we needed to have a metric to measure materiality. I think that's just good credit analysis. But what I don't see here now is it seems to be talking about ESG risks that arise and need the attention of the staff or maybe elevated to the board, as opposed to how are we incorporating an evaluation of ESG risks into the investments we make? Because this seems to talk much more about sort of after the fact rather than the investments as we make them, and so it doesn't really seem to me that it's dealing with the question of when we make investments, we will consider ESG factors when they are material to the long-term success of that investment. I have questions for anybody who drafted this, and I was part of the subcommittee, but I mean, I think there was a lot of work done since the last subcommittee meeting. Do you want to weigh in, Tom?
Could I interject? I mean, I think we're all trying to make too much of this, and answer a lot of questions, more questions than this addresses. This addresses how does the staff winnow down those things that come to investment committee meetings, either because they've identified an issue with a particular investment and are considering it, but it's not very, and they find a way through it, or one of 10,000 people with very well-intentioned motives and working on very important issues come to use our meetings as a platform, limited platform as it is. I think if we want to address how we use our very considerable influence in the investment world and in other parts of the world as citizens, because we have points of view on environmental, social, employment, all sorts of issues that don't go to directly how we're investing day to day. And don't forget that the great majority of our investments are index investments, and adherence to the index is the governing principle. So if we're not doing that, then I think we need another forum and vehicle for people, cause-oriented people to come to, talk to some portion of the board and convince the board to become active. And frankly, I don't think we're active enough to suit me on some of these issues, although they're not particularly, from my point of view, material to our long-term investment results.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Because I missed that part, and the reason is because we have basically a two-page policy here, and it's not until halfway through the second page that the issue you're raising is even made clear. So maybe if we could just say at the top, the purpose of this is,
right,
and kind of elevate to the top what starts at the bottom of the second page with A, B, C, because I missed that part. And if that's the specific and narrow purpose of this, I think it does a really good job of that. And I'm in favor of that.
So Paul, I think that's moving towards a solution. So if you could just reiterate what you just said, because it gives some direction to staff in terms of what they could bring back. You're asking for something to be an opening paragraph to state.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a policy that it's much narrower than what it's titled. Investment policy for mitigating environmental, social, and governance risks, right? I mean, it's a very narrow policy about how the staff and the board shall consider and evaluate the importance of issues that are brought to our attention, what are defined as when faced with a corporate action or decision that potentially violates CalSTR's ESG policies. That's what confused me. It seemed to me that it wasn't talking about so proactively, how do we manage our investments? And that's fine. And so, I mean, I think from that standpoint, this is a really good approach to take to that narrower issue that comes before us. And I'm fine with it. I think it's a really well-developed policy. I just think we need to be very clear up front that that's what this is trying to do, and isn't going beyond that.
So Paul,
that's a good idea.
With that inserted, you would be supportive of this move forward?
Absolutely. I
Okay,
think
so
it's
if the
great.
staff and the consultants capture that, if not here on the tape, please see that that's in the next discussion for July, okay?
Yeah.
So we're going to go to some other colleagues who've been waiting patiently. Thank you for that direction, Paul, and that solution-oriented approach. It's clear that with that, you can be supportive of this, and it will help narrow down what the purpose of this is. Thank you. Ms. Glazer-Hedrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obviously, a lot of work has gone into this, and I'm a newbie to the committee, and so I just have a more practical question. To the extent this is kind of a narrow framework to help guide what comes to the investment committee, can you give an example of a decision or an issue that has come to light that potentially would make it to the committee, and then another issue that you feel like would just be handled, a determination of non-materiality would be made and it would be handled at the staff level, to just give us a flavor of, put a little bit more, perspective on what exactly the decision points are going to be moving forward?
And I think that's where it would be helpful to have some examples in here. The big picture ones that are, and it's probably too easy to think about that way, is an issue like fossil free or tobacco, big affects an industry, broad cut of the portfolio. We definitely spend committee time on. The committee was very involved in an example I gave of a chemical company that had amongst their 49 products of pesticides, one was being tested in strawberry fields in California. And the committee spent time on that. And that would probably be an example of where they would not. They may say to us, because we got told through our call center, and we may engage on that, but the committee wouldn't necessarily have to take time other than just be informed we're working on this issue. That's where the level of materiality was trying to define. I'll come up with some harder examples at the company level of like this company would be where there's and it's kind of like SASB, and I think about that. Carbon isn't that material to technology companies, but workforce labor issues are. And so that's how you define things. Oh, that's right. You're reminding me. I forgot. There was a government contractor. Thank you for taking back that nightmare. A government contractor called CACI, which I think still has a building in D.C., big giant stuff. But they ran the prisons in Iraq. But I don't know, with all their government contracts, that probably would have been below the threshold, but I know the board also, this is back in the 2000s, probably spent a considerable amount of time talking about how they were operated, that we did, Dana? You remember about that? It's like,
Yeah, we all did the CEO here.
we had the CEO here.
Yeah.
Boy, I was here?
Those
That was 03?
Those were helpful examples. And if we need some more, maybe we can bring them back in July, but I thought those were spot on. You still have the floor, Ms. Hendricks. Are you finished?
I'm finished, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Dillon.
So after some of my fellow board members' comments, I think I can see where Paul was going, and Tom, that it almost seems like there's two separate policies here. There's our principles, which really don't have anything to do with the mitigation of the risk, and then there was the mitigation of the risk, so maybe we can take a look at splitting those two. Chris, I know that quite often you get asked, or staff gets asked, for a copy of our 21 risk factors from either our constituency groups or our stakeholders and things like that. I'm not so sure as a board member, I want to make all our investment guidelines just somebody asks for the guidelines, we hand them out the guidelines. I'm not sure that that's beneficial to either them or us. If we put these 21 risk factors in our guidelines, I'd still like to see them accessible to people that request them. Or if people are asking, what type of things are you taking into consideration? Can we just pull out something out of our guidelines to be able to give that to them so it's still accessible?
The answer is yes, I believe so. I don't think we've had that occurrence happen in the past, so it just hasn't come up. And the one thing I would say that the value of it being at guidelines, there's more flexibility at the staff.
Right.
We can say, we need to add something, or we need to change what this means. But our managers, it's interesting, as Ann has gone through this process, some of our own staff have said, hey, I like the black and white nature of the guidelines. I know what is and what isn't.
Right.
Principles, as Harry said, is more subjective and tougher. So, in many of our investment manager guidelines, these risk factors are listed. And
Right.
so there will be, just have to be note that it's an evolving document, constantly changing, and that copy we give somebody is as of that date.
Alrighty, thank you.
Last speaker, Mr. Unterman?
Oh, I think I've
You're
done
done?
it.
Okay, good. So, anybody else, any other staff members or the consultants want to add anything? If not, if I recall correctly, there was direction and support by the committee that the suggestion by Mr. Rosensteel, staff understands what that was. To the extent we think that we need some more specific examples as requested by Ms. Glazer-Hedrick, we'll see some of those as well in July. This was helpful. Let's keep in mind, nothing fundamentally is going to be changing in terms of how we operate, what we believe in, and what we value. We're hopeful that this will improve our effectiveness. So with that, let's hear from the public. We have a few members of the public that have asked to speak on this item. And Mr. Knapp, Ms. Sweeney, and Ms. Sylvie, if you could come to the microphone. Is Mr. Knapp here? Mr. Knapp? Mr. Knapp is not here. Ms. Sweeney, Darcy Sweeney. This is on item 12, right, Ms. Sweeney? Okay, so let me just bear with me, please, okay? Thanks. I'm trying just to manage the meeting efficiently. So we have requests to speak on item 12. Okay, great. All right, come on up. This is the time to speak on item 12. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We recognize that that it's now a principles-based rather than a, and that you've eliminated the 21 ESG risk factors. But in your examples that would be used to, quotes, assist CalSTRS staff and external investment managers in their investment analysis and decision-making, you do include those as something, and in your discussion, clearly these are risk factors that are going to be still used in some way or another. And I did notice that climate change is listed there as simply one of 8 environmental risks. And I think that we'd like to say that even in a sample list, we'd ask that you identify climate change somehow as an overriding category, because it does take in all other environmental risks. And in the current list, some of the factors like GHG emissions and energy management are actually subsets of climate change-induced problems. Beyond that, each of the other risks, while problems in themselves are magnified by climate change, take biodiversity. Right now, Western landscapes are losing biodiversity as warmer temperatures bring millions of bark beetles that decimate our forests. And you know, in a future of unchecked global warming, that would bring massive loss of species, as described in The Sixth Extinction by New Yorker writer Elizabeth Colbert. So climate change is so exacerbates each of the other risk factors that we think it should be identified somehow in your examples as a key factor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to, I apologize if we weren't clear. We're not abandoning the 21 risk factors. Those risk factors are just being placed someplace else within our documents. Okay, so I just want to be clear that no one in the audience or listening thinks CalSTRS is abandoning our 21 risk factors. We're not. They're just being moved to a different place in our
Right.
manuals.
I do understand it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, anyone else on item 12?
I have one last question, if I may.
One last question, Ms.
So-
Hendricks.
Mr. Chair, so this
Yes.
is coming back to us in July?
Yes.
And you had mentioned something, Chris, about getting feedback from stakeholders, and so I was just wondering how you imagine, because I definitely have heard from folks wanting to give input, and I'm just wondering what that would look like for stakeholders to get input on.
Well, I had hoped they would come and give input today.
Yeah.
But obviously Geraldine has been relaying that to Ann, and
Okay.
our door is open, and
Okay,
we certainly have contact information out there, so hopefully they will let us know so we can come forward. But normally this would kind of be like a first reading, and then, our goal is to bring it to you in July for adoption, so hopefully we'll see.
great.
And I have received separately, when we publish it, input. So if you feel there's more that.
I'm just asking.
Okay.
I just know.
Yeah, because even
other-
before the April meeting, I got input from some of the stakeholders.
Okay,
Okay.
great, thank you.
All right, thanks, everyone. Brings us to item 13 on the agenda, which is Christopher Elman, you're going to lead us on this one. This is the divestment policy, non-U.S. thermal coal. This is an action item, so I'm going to take the members of the public, Chris, before you speak. There are members of the public that would like to speak on this item. I have 3 members of the public that want to speak on item 13. Deborah Sylvie, Darcy Sweeney, Eric Knapp.
Good bites.
Hello again. This is Deborah Sylvie, Fossil Free California. And I want to thank you for allowing me to speak formally. And this is a crucial time. It's less than a week since President Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, as you well know. And given that reckless decision, we are committed to even more to a transition away from fossil fuels. As part of our commitment, we ask 2 things of CalSTRS today. First, take credit for what you've accomplished and build on that. And second, please stay open to arguments for divestment whenever possible, especially regarding today's decision on non-U.S. thermal coal. But first, do take credit. We appreciate your strong voice on climate change, including at those Paris talks. We appreciate your investment in clean energy last year. We appreciate your work as part of the shareholder engagement that got transparency resolutions passed at Occidental and at Exxon. They were important wins. And the fact that these resolutions were backed for the first time by Blackstone and others in finance indicates that those fossil fuel companies can be pressured to do more. So we ask that CalSTRS be an even stronger voice in shareholder engagement. Trump's decision last week galvanized climate leaders in California and across the nation to intensify their commitments to clean energy. We ask you to join them. For example, in future resolutions, press fossil fuel companies to go beyond reporting and toward making real investments in alternative energy. So finally, our biggest ask today is that you, in these unprecedented times, divest for the climate wherever possible. Continue the good work from last year and divest from all non-U.S. thermal coal. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Darcy Sweeney?
Hi, Darcy
Hi.
Sweeney with Fossil Free California. Despite Donald Trump's ill-considered rejection of the Paris Climate Agreement, renewable energy is the future. A recent article in the Financial Times, The Big Green Bang, How Renewable Energy Became Unstoppable, asks the question, will the 21st century be the last one for fossil fuels? It describes how the transition to renewables is happening much faster than anyone could have imagined just a decade ago. The article recounts the disruptive impact green energy is having on entire industries across the globe. So not only is the planet imperiled by fossil fuel consumption, with only years, not decades, to turn things around, but the renewable energy revolution is going full tilt. The ever-improving economics of green energy, as well as a commitment by world leaders to move away from fossil fuels, despite the Trump administration, spells the end of the fossil fuel era. So please, CalSTRS Board, continue the good work of SB 185 and vote today to divest from foreign thermal coal. Take your place alongside other California leaders in the struggle to save the planet. Don't be on the wrong side of history. Divest from coal and all fossil fuels now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Knapp?
Eric Knapp with Coal Free California. February of this year, the Irish Parliament voted to divest the country's sovereign wealth fund within 5 years and ban fully all future investments in coal. And with typical Irish passion, Thomas Pringle, who introduced the bill before the Irish Parliament, said, "This principle of ethical financing is a symbol to those global corporations that their continual manipulation of the climate science, denial of the existence of the climate change, and their controversial lobbying practices of politicians around the world is no longer tolerated. We cannot accept their actions while millions of poor people in undeveloped nations bear the brunt of climate change forces. As they experience famine, mass immigration, and civil unrest as a result of climate change, national governments have an essential role to play in backing up their Paris pledges by ensuring public funds are well placed to support the clean energy transition and are protected from the inevitable decline of the fossil fuel/coal industry." And recently, Harvard University, after much gnashing of teeth, has actually paused direct investments in coal. And I will read now just a short list of entities around the world that have divested from coal and fossil fuels. Stockholm University, Stirling College, Oregon State, Chico State, London School of Economics, Georgetown University, cities such as Sydney, Stuttgart, Seattle, Santa Monica, San Francisco, Minneapolis, Copenhagen, Berlin, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Go Wolverines. Assorted groups such as Grantham Foundation, Santa Clara Valley Water District, Ben & Jerry's Foundation, Blumenthal Foundation, District of Columbia Retirement Board, the Pax Fund, World Council of Churches, Alliance Group of Germany, Norway's Government Pension Fund, Amalgamated Bank, Bordeaux, France, California Academy of Sciences, Chicago Medical Society, the country of Ireland, Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation, David Suzuki Foundation, and hopefully CalSTRS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Knapp. Okay, so we're going to turn this over to Mr. Edelman. Before we do, Philip LaRue, that's an A paper. You and, who else was this? Mr. Swanigan? Is that? Or who's? Yeah. Yeah, that's an A. It's a great, great paper. It's tremendous, the quality and the depth. Did a good job. So, they've laid out for us 5 nice choices. There might be more, but let's try to stay kind of focused in on what the task is here. So I don't know who's, it says Christopher Ailman, so.
Which is not appropriate, because I think I made the mistake of just starting it, because I've done all the dress and stuff, but I wanted to acknowledge, just as you has done, that Philip and Arinthio did an awesome job putting this together. We thankfully have a long history of working on these kinds of things. We wanted to make sure that the record was adequate for you to make any decision you wanted. So because of that, it's important, I think, for the audience to understand, we always present the pros and cons of this. You're making an investment decision. And so we want to present to you the opportunities, but also the risks, so you can weigh both sides of it. It's important, I think, for the audience to know the board has already decided over a year ago to divest of U.S. coal, which is out of our indexes and out of our portfolio, and the active managers are blocked from buying that. We wanted to do additional work on the question of non-U.S. coal. Non-U.S., we realized very quickly the developed market's very low, very few coal companies, only a few that met our criteria. It really was in the emerging markets, and that's where we want to do much deeper dive, and why we gave you the memo to bring in the fact that, the environmental risk we've identified and made it clear, but really there was the human health and the human aspect of it. As we've said, 400 million people in India without electricity. They're mostly burning burning wood and animal dung, and the quality of life question with that. So it does bring in other nuances. I had a chance to talk to California Teachers Association, CTA, last Saturday, and one of the questions was about how do you weigh things, and just the fact that all these decisions are very complex. They are not necessarily black and white. They are very broad. So we are bringing to you all the information. Philip did an awesome job of identifying where the exposures are. Our exposure, not surprisingly, because the emerging markets were 100% active. So we do not follow a passive index. We've begun to talk about that, so that may be in our future. Don't just assume the way the portfolio is today, because whatever decision you make would stand for a while. But it's not surprising our active managers have chosen not to own these companies because it hasn't done that well. In our discussion with them, they would prefer that they not be restricted because they would like it as a potential opportunity should it, particularly in India and other places, become of interest. Jack's given us numerous articles from his travels. India, really does want to move to renewable energy. But just to the sheer size of the population, that's 10 years out where they're still going to have to rely, unfortunately, on very dirty coal, not just coal. So we make the case of why this could be an investment opportunity, but also why it could be eliminated. And I believe Harvey Lederman, your fiduciary counsel, gave you very good guidance on what to consider when it comes to divestment. But, as we've said, we're here to answer your questions. This is definitely an investment decision you have to make. You have numerous options because it is a little bit in the developed markets. So again, developed markets are the larger nations, particularly with coal. Think of Australia. But then in the emerging countries, India, China, where the economies are booming, and a high demand for energy. Philip, do you want to add anything? No. Okay. I didn't warn you, so that's not fair. That's good.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. Ailman. We have a couple people that are in the queue.
I'm sorry. One thing I want to note, INV 50, just to understand in our research, Philip and Aisha Mastagni did travel to India and meet with some of the members of their energy department, met with one of the world's leading researchers on India, and I guess the fossil-free crowd will appreciate this. I believe it was the hottest day on record in India. You were there, it was 113, so they got to experience that, unfortunately, firsthand. Aisha said she will never go back, she'll resign if we send her. Yeah, I assume, Philip, you probably felt the same way, but.
It wasn't that bad. It was worse for, I was in the Marines. I slept in rock quarries a lot. And so, we did go, it was very interesting. We met with government, we met with the industry, we met with the companies, and we met with environmental groups. And across all of them, they've said, no, coal is a necessity. I don't think they're happy about it, but they're talking about electrifying 400 million people, and the health hazards and the other social concerns they have in their country is not a top priority. Their priority is getting electrification and helping their populace. And when they're talking electrification, they're not talking about American style. They use, I think it was 1/12 of the electricity there. Maybe have a refrigerator and possibly a TV and lights. That's it. The level of electrification they're seeking. So.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to questions or comments. Ms. Glazer Hedrick?
Yeah, I'd actually like to make a motion on behalf of the state treasurer that CalSTRS fully divest of its non-U.S. thermal coal holdings across both developed and emerging markets.
Second.
Before, Ms. Shi, you were next in line. Did you?
Great, thank you.
I'm sorry. It was properly. It was
I second the
properly.
motion.
It was properly seconded by Mr. Unterman. Ms. Shi, there's a motion on the floor. Would you like to speak
I'd
to
like
it?
to speak in support of the motion, thank you.
I don't want Madam Chair to rule me out of order, Ms. Dillon.
So first, I want to thank the staff for the tremendous analysis before us, and this is a serious decision that the committee will be making, but I also appreciate all the engagement work that's been done to date that has informed, I think, the rationale for supporting the motion. I think what we've learned through the engagement is certainly the need for many of our developing countries to still rely on coal for their primary energy source and being supplied by many of our developed countries. But I think what we've also learned from coal companies is that they're always going to be coal companies. They're not transitioning to much of anything else. And when we look at the holdings that we currently have relative to our investments, it's fairly small and may not impact this decision that's on the table now to divest. But I think even if we were to have further engagement, many of the foreign thermal coal companies in developing nations, it makes the engagement very hard when most of the firms are controlled by foreign governments. And I'm not so sure that we make a lot of progress with respect to where else we could be on that. So I would support the motion and just would like to put on the record that, with respect to our fiduciary considerations, that the risks, I think, are there, that our holdings are small, and our preferred approach of engagement, I think, is tenuous at best, given that many of these firms aren't controlled by foreign governments.
Thank you, Ms. Shi. Ms. Glazer Hedrick, I'd like to give you the opportunity if you want to speak to your motion. If you could way back in, I'll click on you to get you back. You push your button.
While a vote to divest is not always the most desirable approach to effecting responsible
Would you
investment.
just hold 1 second? I want to make sure your mic is on.
Sorry,
Is it on?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, good.
Excuse me. While a vote to divest is not always the most desirable approach to effective, responsible investment policy, such divestment with regard to non-U.S. thermal coal holdings is the right move at the right time. Now more than ever, especially in light of the president's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords, it's time for CalSTRS to move towards energy investments that are sensitive to climate change and its carbon footprint.
Thank you, Ms. Glazer Hedrick. We have other members who want to speak? Or Tom, Mr. Unterman, and then Dana, would you? Tom, Mr. Unterman.
So I support the motion as well. This is an interesting issue. I think Betty made a very important point. It is not something that materially affects our investment results in any way. That said, it is an important moral question at a time when our parts of our country have to speak on important moral questions. The other thing that's very interesting is this is a very changing area. And I mean, I read on the plane ride here today that India is completely changing their energy strategy as we speak, with adopting a goal of being completely solar and wind by 2050. So this is something that's happening fast, and we shouldn't do something that might get in the way.
Thank you, Mr. Unterman. Ms. Dillon.
So I really appreciate the report. I thought it was very, very extremely detailed. When you were researching this, did you find that there was anybody doing anything with technology, trying to develop something that's going to deal with the CO2 output from coal usage? Seeing that it sounds like so much of the world is still going to be heading down that trail, regardless of possibly what India ends up doing. So I read a little bit about carbon capture and storage, but that's all underground. How safe is that really? I mean, what all did you find out, Phil?
For India, actually, their system's really inefficient. Their biggest gains in reducing their outputs are by increasing improving their infrastructure and modernizing their plants. So right now, all the new plants have to be supercritical or ultra supercritical, where right now they're running Russian-built plants from the 50s still, which are so where they can really lower their emissions is just by upgrading the infrastructure.
So have you found anyone trying to work on anything to deal with the CO2 output then?
When we were doing U.S. coal, I went to the coal conference on coal in Pittsburgh, and a lot of the presentations were actually about those projects. Part of the issue is that the U.S. won't invest in it. Nobody wants to be attached to coal, so it's all technology coming from abroad, mainly Chinese. So I'm not
All right, thank you.
particularly enthusiastic of it that it's going to go.
Right. Artie, thank you.
Sure, Mr. Unterman wants to just.
Yeah, so for another very obscure purpose, and this is something I've been actually reading about a lot the last couple of weeks. So in Denmark, for the first time, there's a large industrial installation that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. The good news is it is there, but it costs something like $175 million. And to address our problem, we would need maybe 250,000 of these things in the world.
Yeah, cost
So that's
prohibitive, yeah.
expensive. So that's one. Second, in India, the biggest source of CO2 is actually burning wood and dung.
Right.
And the best way to address that is there's a number of companies now that have developed highly efficient stoves that burn this material so efficiently that the aggregate amount of CO2 is reduced a little bit. One is called Bitlite, and there's two others.
Right.
And so there is hope.
Thank you, Tom.
Ms. Ortega.
Yeah, I had just a question, kind of along the lines of the issue that Tom raised in his previous comment. So it seemed like two things, and to me, came after maybe you were completed with the report, which is the kind of the response to the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty, which seemed to be a lot of kind of further support from those folks who are staying in, and just kind of a tone of whether that has any impact, along with the information that seems to be coming out of India, that perhaps the electrification is happening quicker than might have been thought. There's a line in the report that says, that in the short to medium term, coal companies in the emerging markets have strong demand. And I just wondered if any of that kind of recent activity, would there be any sense of, not necessarily a complete revision of that thinking, but just that maybe the momentum is going in another direction?
They have revised to not build out all the coal plants that were on the list when we were there. It's a very political issue as well for them, especially that while we were there, if you were saying we were not going to build them, it's kind of a mess. Oh, sorry. If you were saying you're not going to build them, it could be a signal to the populace, maybe we're not going to electrify everybody. So there's a lot of signaling, so they may not have ever intended to build them. And so there's that complexity. We talked to them about solar, because they had already committed to I think it was 220 gigawatts by 2022. But India has very complex land rules and who can object to projects, and solar requires a lot of land and a lot of water. So.
One thing I'd add is it highlights, Ms. Ortega, the complexity of making an investment decision. The fact pattern, that's why we have TV screens upstairs and all the data feeds for our staff, is the information and the decision you make is constantly changing. But when you adopt a divestment, while we revisit it periodically, it is pretty much carving it in not even soft stone. It's pretty much out there. We'll revisit this with you, but the fact pattern changes even in the 2 weeks that we write the memo. I think we'd still stay by the statement, it would depend on the time frame. 10 years out, no, it's probably not a good investment, but the posturing and the wording means they'll move faster. But that's one of the things, the reason for our staff recommendation of not recommending divestment was simply because the active managers are better tuned to make that decision because they have minute-by-minute information. But with that said, it's up to the board's discretion.
So just on I'm sorry, Mr. Ortega, are you done with the floor? So on a going forward basis, should we move into any sort of passive management and indexing in the emerging markets? Staff will work with managers to customize benchmarks and how complicated or to what extent is that complicated. And that may be something that has implications to compensation, but that's not for today. I just want to know how complicated will it be or not be to customize benchmarks?
Well, it's not at all. We pay a fee, so it's not difficult. We pay money.
Right.
And I realize I don't want to broadcast this live on the internet to Bloomberg and the world in terms of when we will get out of our current positions. We will take our time and make, if this motion passed, we do it prudently. We put out a restricted list to our managers, so they automatically restrict any of those future purchases. We would add that to the restricted list. We would also make this all the indices. Right now, the U.S. indices are ex-U.S. coal. We would then add that to the non-U.S. indices. And as Philip and I have discussed, they'll find a reason to charge us another added fee for that, but it's de minimis.
Some of this finer detail might
But
be
it's
better
not hard for us to execute.
For closed session anyway,
And
so.
we would be, the actual transactions would take time, but we would not take that long.
Good, okay.
I'd like to make what I hope is a friendly amendment.
If I could take Ms. Yee first, and I'll come back to you, okay?
Yeah, just one point. So, Chris, when you bring this back, oftentimes when we're asked to look at these types of decisions, we're thinking more on the risk side, but obviously things are moving quickly as it relates to energy, and certainly with more countries really engaging and being more visible about their energy future, and been very heartened by what our governor's doing in China, for example. So as you bring it back, could we also just get a little bit of a flavor about what some of the opportunities are? Because I think those are going to probably become more.
Yes, I should clarify, the way we bring any divestment back to you is part of a divestment report, which now they get semi-annually? I think so. Semi-annually, you get a divestment report that talks about whether there's a gain or loss on that decision. We don't bring back a full packet of reevaluating it unless the committee says we want to revisit that particular issue, which we've done once in our history. On the opportunity side, in terms of climate change, that's the bigger, broader effort that we're doing across the whole portfolio. And I would say that's really in the green report. If you want us to merge those two in some way, we can. Your divestment policy has other issues, obviously, like firearms illegal in California and things, Iran, Sudan. So we've tended to separate them. But
That's fine.
we're giving you the information on a regular basis.
Okay, as long as it's not lost.
Mr. Unterman.
Yeah, so I'm proposing, this is a friendly amendment to the motion. We are covering now publicly traded securities, and that's what we've been talking about. I'd like to add that we cover investments in the private equity and project finance portfolios as well.
Mr. Elmer, you want to speak to that?
We can put this in side letters going forward, that we want the right to opt out. We have found it is nearly impossible to remove them once we are in the partnerships because we don't have the legal right to do so. But we would, anytime you put a divestment, we include that in our future side letters that we have the right to opt out.
Okay, and real estate as well. Okay.
Any partnership.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Unterman. Is that a friendly amendment? I got to check with the maker of the motion. That's a friendly amendment. Okay, thank you. So that is added to the motion. And I see Ms. Worth is okay over there, which is good. And Mr. Rosensteel.
Thanks. So, I too was in India recently, but not visiting with coal officials. However, I saw a lot of dung everywhere along the road, and a lot of dung being burned, and it's not a pretty sight. What comes off of the dung as it's burned. So, the report concluded that to invest or to stay invested or to divest has an immaterial impact on our portfolio returns. From the time that you were in India and looked at all of their thinking and their plans and the like, do you have any sense that to divest would have any impact on the carbon footprint of energy consumption in India?
Actually, no impact at all. I think they're very adamant. We're going to electrify the country for our people. This is our priority, and they're very upset that the U.S. would dictate to them, we're fully electrified, and to tell them you can't after, as they see it, we've created the problem of climate change.
So for us to divest would have no impact on our portfolio or their carbon footprint for energy use. It may be something we want to do, but I'm at least based on what you're saying, I'm not. If I were to vote to divest, I wouldn't be doing so, thinking I was helping to address the global warming problem.
From what I saw, I do not think it will affect their policy.
Mr. Temkin?
Just to be consistent, Mr. Rosensteel, there's no evidence that when you divest, there isn't a ready market for people to buy those securities in every single instance where you've done so. So there's no evidence it changes behavior.
Okay. So for us to make a decision to do this would just be to say, we don't want to be a party to this industry in
I think you'd be
the
relying upon
non-domestic coal industry.
You'd be relying on the research that your staff has presented to you based upon the arguments that they made.
Right. Okay. So, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Temkin, and I'm sure Mr. Liederman would step in if he thought there was anything else that we needed to cover for the record. And since he hasn't approached, I'm assuming we've covered it both in comments as well as the staff write-up for us to proceed along these lines. And if he thought otherwise, I would encourage him to step forward. Ms. Heeger? And if we could maybe make this the last comment, then we'll just take the vote, if that's okay, just time management. Thank you. Unless there's anyone who has not spoken on the issue that would like to. Okay. Ms. Heeger.
Thank you. So I just wanted to inquire about one of the comments that was in the report regarding potential risks of divestment, and it was I think the last paragraph in that section that points out that a lot of the thermal coal companies have government ownership, and there's, the potential for us to hinder our ability to make, additional investments in that country, in green energy in the emerging markets. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Is that based on, I guess, just any background that you can share about what that is based on?
Well, kind of the speculation of it was that if they pursue clean energy, but they do it because it's a government-controlled entity, and they do it through existing entities such as Coal India, is where they pursue these projects, we would have already divested, and it's unlikely that those projects would flip them in terms of the threshold.
So that really is, okay, so that has to do with future green energy investments by those same companies in those emerging markets?
There's that, and then there's the perception of CalSTRS as an investor coming in, into partnerships as the one that has pushed divestment. So let's say, our image could be tarnished in that area in the investment area of the world, so.
Anyone like to speak on the item that has not spoken on the item? Okay, Ms. Yamamoto?
Just a little bit of history again. On Exhibit A in Investment 61, so all of these companies produce or have something to do with coal.
These are all companies who derive more than 50% of their revenue from the sale of thermal
Okay.
coal.
Okay.
Seeing no one else in the queue, I don't think we need to read the motion back. There was also the amendment, and everyone is clear on what the amendment was and is. So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? May the record reflect that the committee voted unanimously to fully divest from thermal coal in the emerging markets. Thank you. Non-US, non-US.
Technically.
Okay, thanks. Okay, with that, let's take I know we're tight on time, but I do think it would be best for us to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 5:30.